Overwhelmed. Although no one in Maybury admitted to it, people would move away from Edna in the grocery shop. Whatever aisle she was in would empty as if a tidal wave preceded her. She was just too much. A large woman whose body moved without grace. She had a tendency to knock over displays of cans, shelves of soap powder, or stands of comics. A loud woman, whatever she said, carried through the shop, so that no conversation with her was ever private. A talkative woman, her long exchanges wore down listeners. The inhabitants of Maybury took the path of least resistance, staying out of her way whenever they could. This compounded the problem. Starved of conversation, when she did succeed in cornering a hapless listener, her focus in the ensuing conversation would limelight every detail of her life, her likes and dislikes, her everything. As with all who lived in Maybury, a unique combination of circumstances had created this singular individual. Growing up in the back streets of a Midland city, when mother died, as the youngest daughter, she was selected by her already married older siblings to be the one who would look after father in his old age. Too young to fully understand the implications of this unspoken but collective decision, she missed her opportunity to object or refuse. Coming from a genetic line of unusual longevity, father had also inherited an unbending Edwardian outlook from his strong-willed father. On the wider stage of a world war, women may have made great strides in proving their equality, but in the two-up, two-down world in which this father and daughter lived, women were forever underlings, to be seen but not heard, to do what they were told without question. Her days were long, filled with cooking and housework. Father refused to release her to the war effort. His needs were more immediate, and most soul-destroying of all for Edna, devoid of any conversation beyond basic instructions. At the age of 43, father's death freed her from this life of repression. Her siblings made a second unified decision, selling the family home with haste and dividing the spoils. Fleeing the city and its memories, Edna moved to a picturesque town in a neighbouring county, drawn there by an advertisement for a position as curator of its local museum. She had spent many evenings reading to her myopic father from books on his favourite topic, military battles of the English Civil War. As the town's chief claim to fame was the site of a major battle fought in 1642, she was a knowledgeable and obvious candidate for the post. Over many months, a friendship, tentative at first but deepening over time, grew between her and the museum's most frequent visitor, a history teacher from St. Woodford's School for Boys. Nigel, like her father, had a passion for the battles of the English Civil War, but unlike her father, was quiet, retiring, almost shy. She often wondered how he survived the strife of teaching teenage boys. But the effectiveness of the discipline system in St. Woodford's was well established. It also helped that Nigel was one of those individuals who could escape the world of reality and its difficulties when necessary, by retreating within the safe confines of his own mind. She suspected that Cavaliers and Roundheads featured much more often in his thoughts than history syllabi and larking homework. He did overcome his social unease with remarkable success on one occasion. Much to Edna's shock and delighted surprise, he proposed one Saturday evening when they had just finished eating dinner at a local hotel. The following year saw their wedding on her 46th birthday and the subsequent buying of a house in a new estate in Maybury. From there they travelled daily to the nearby town, to their respective work. Her 50th birthday was spent alone. Nigel, with no medical history of heart disease, had a sudden stroke 3 years after their wedding and died within hours. Edna, who had only just become used to being a wife, was now a widow. She had flourished as a wife, been married to Nigel, a good listener with endless loving tolerance, had led to the emergence of a woman she did not recognize. One who was chatty, who spoke to friends and strangers with equal pleasure. An opened heart, so long suppressed, now bubbling over with happiness, meant that words poured from her, shared her joy with everyone she met. She had become used to sharing her thoughts, her heart, her soul with Nigel, and with all those around her. Now she was adrift. The house held no one to listen, no one with whom to share her world. But a dam once dismantled can rarely be choked up again. Forced to be silent at home, she continued to spill over onto those she met outside. Furthermore, as her 50s passed, she found she'd inherited a trait from her mother's side of the family, an early onset of deafness. Her voice became louder and louder, without her realizing. By the time she retired as curator at 60, some on the museum board heaved a sigh of relief. Her talks about the Civil War had boomed like cannon shot over the heads of the local school children, who, as a result, had not encouraged their parents to bring them back for a family visit. Entrance numbers had fallen, only a little, but enough to be noticeable. After retirement, Edna lived on in her Maybury house alone, talking with gusto to all she met outside, unable to push the chatterer she had become back into its box. Trying to fill the void inside her four walls by indulging her love of cooking, her waistline spread with each comforting cottage pie or sweet apple turnover. Inch by inch she became the Edna whom the people of Maybury met in the grocery shop, a woman who overflowed uninvited into their space. People began to avoid her whenever possible. Early one morning, Edna happened upon the unexpected. At the bottom of her drive lay a small striped cat, little more than a kitten, mewling faintly, back legs askew, blood oozing onto the pavement. She swept the tiny body off to the veterinary clinic, where Richard, on the emergency shift that morning, confirmed that the undernourished and collarless feline appeared to be both a stray and the victim of a car accident. He reassured her. "I can operate, but we've no space where the poor thing can recuperate. We've had an overflow after an RSPCA raid in a nearby farm, and who'd pay?" Without hesitation, Edna arranged that she would take the small creature home after surgery that afternoon. All post-operative care would be up to her, and at her expense. Throughout the following night, Edna talked to the small cat. She called him, for it was a he, Thomas. She thought this was so obvious a name for a tomcat that if the worst happened, she would feel less bereft than if she'd given him a special, personal name. As she tended to any necessary medical care, she told Thomas all about Nigel, about her father, about growing up in the city, even about the battles of the English Civil War. She felt that her voice was holding a thread between them, If she talked enough to keep his attention, he wouldn't slip away. Neither he did. When Richard paid a house call the following day, he declared that the tiny heartbeat was steady under the circumstances. Also, it was now unlikely that Thomas would lose either back leg. By the following week, when it was obvious that Thomas was out of danger, Richard and Edna discussed what would happen next. As father had never allowed pets, and as she and Nigel were both out of the house all day at work, she'd never considered having an animal. Richard pointed out it was unlikely that anyone would ever want Thomas, as he'd always have a limp. It seemed fated. She had acquired a cat. In future visits to the surgery to check on its recovery, Edna and Richard talked more about that first night, about how she'd felt she was keeping the tiny invalid alive by talking. Richard agreed it could only have had a beneficial effect, regretting that personal care of that sort was something they did not have the staff or resources to provide at the clinic. From these conversations, without conscious creation, a new life pattern began for Edna. Whenever an animal needed overnight post-operative supervision, it would be brought to what had been Nigel's office, now converted by Edna into a tiny veterinary ward. Surrounded by the appropriate equipment, selected by Richard and paid for out of her pension fund, she would sit in a comfortable reclining chair, sometimes dozing, but most often talking to whatever poor creature needed the sound of a friendly voice to cling to, all the better for being loud. It didn't matter if they were too weak or ill to reply, as Edna mightn't hear them anyway as her deafness increased. But her eyesight was fine. She was able to see the moment when, many, many times, her fierce desire to keep the sick and injured alive helped them to turn a corner. Afterwards, if she kept the odd one which had nowhere to go in recovery, it was because there was always enough room in her home for another soul. Over time, the townsfolk of Maybury came to value her tenacity and determination to heal. Often a barely known face would approach her in the shop or on the street to tell her how the dog or cat or rabbit she'd kept alive was now thriving. They'd apologise for intruding, but just needed to let her know how grateful they were for her overwhelming generosity and largesse of heart.